Have you ever walked away from someone, not in anger, not in chaos, not in desperation, but in clarity? In stillness? And then watched as everything about them unraveled? Maybe it surprised you. Maybe it even confused you. How could something as simple, as peaceful, as silent as walking away cause such a devastating reaction? That's what we're diving into today. Because there's a powerful, often misunderstood truth hidden here. We've been taught all our lives that if you want to protect yourself, you have to fight back. Yell. Defend. Expose. But what if that's wrong? What if real power, the kind that lasts, the kind that leaves a permanent mark, isn't in resistance, but in refusal? Not in clashing with toxicity, but in no longer being available for it? Let me ask you something. Have you been led to believe that in order to heal or move on, you need closure? That you have to explain your side of the story? That silence is weakness? That detachment is giving up? These are popular myths. And they've led many of us to stay too long, fight too hard, or bleed energy into people who only wanted control. But what if the greatest move you could ever make is no longer participating? Not out of cowardice, but out of conscious, grounded strength? What if the most dangerous thing you could do to someone who built their power on manipulating your emotions is to simply stop showing up? See, here's what most people get wrong. They think healing means proving something. They think strength means pushing back. But in Stoicism, real, grounded, ancient Stoicism, it's the opposite. Strength lies in composure. In walking away not to escape, but to rise. In Stoic Relationships, the most courageous act isn't confrontation, it's detachment. And that's what destroys them. Because manipulators expect noise. They need reaction. They fuel themselves off your confusion, your anger, your heartbreak. But when you give them nothing? When you walk away with your power intact? That's when their world begins to collapse. Today, we're pulling the curtain back. We're not just talking about how walking away affects them, we're breaking it down. What really falls apart when you leave? Why does your silence echo louder than any argument? Why is your healing the one thing they fear the most? And how do you rebuild after walking away, not with bitterness, but with clarity and strength? This is where everything changes. So stay with me. What you'll learn today could shift how you view yourself, your past, and your power. It could finally give you the closure you never got, and the strength you didn't know you had. We're not just exposing manipulation. We're showing what Stoic healing really looks like. And by the end of this, you'll understand why your calm exit was never weakness. It was the final blow. Let's begin. 1. The illusion of control was their foundation. They never expected you to leave. Not really. They expected a reaction, rage, tears, desperation, confusion, anything but stillness. And that's the first illusion they built their world on, that your silence would mean surrender, that your composure would signal collapse. But what they never realized, or maybe what they arrogantly refused to believe, is that their control over you was never real. It was borrowed. Temporary. Illusory. Because what they had wasn't power. It was proximity. Access. The ability to reach into your emotional world because you once let them. And the truth is, they mistook that access for ownership. That's what manipulators do. They see empathy as permission. They interpret vulnerability as a pass to twist the narrative, to invade your identity, to shape you into what serves their ego. They convince themselves they hold sway over you not because of mutual respect, but because of subtle domination. And when someone builds their sense of importance on controlling another person's reality, your awakening becomes their unraveling. Think about it. How often did they test you? Push boundaries just enough to provoke but not enough to push you away? How often did they use praise as a leash and silence as a punishment? How often did they try to be everything to you while quietly dismantling who you were? These aren't questions to haunt you, they're questions to free you. Because once you start asking them, you start seeing through the game. You start realizing that what you called love may have been emotional labor. What you called connection was often performance. And what you thought was stability was in fact manipulation wearing a calm mask. That's the cruel brilliance of emotional control. It hides in plain sight. It mimics intimacy. It masquerades as care. But beneath the surface, it's all about power. Not loud, visible dominance, but quiet, psychological precision. That's what Stoicism teaches us to recognize. Not just what people say, but how they move. How they condition you. How they pull strings without ever appearing to touch them. In Stoic Relationships, we look at motive, not performance. We observe action, not explanation. And most importantly, we ground ourselves in reason, because reason is the antidote to gaslighting. And gaslighting is the core weapon of manipulators who build empires on emotional confusion. See, they didn't want you to think clearly. They needed you to second-guess yourself. Because a confident you is a free you. And a free you is a threat to everything they built. That's why they kept you slightly unsure about your value, your instincts, your memories. That's why they'd smile and invalidate you in the same breath. That's why they'd shift the blame so smoothly that you'd start apologizing for things they did. All of that was the illusion. The illusion that they knew better. That they were more stable. That you needed their approval to be whole. But here's the truth they can't face. The moment you saw through it, the moment you questioned the foundation, everything began to shake, not for you, but for them. Because their power wasn't in who they were. It was in who you thought they were. And once that illusion broke, so did their control. That's what Stoicism gives you. Not just strength to endure, but clarity to see. And what you saw, finally, was the scaffolding of their persona, the mask that needed your belief to survive. They weren't strong. They were strategic. They weren't composed. They were performative. They weren't loving. They were controlling. And when you started seeing them, not as the hero of your life but as the architect of your confusion, the entire illusion began to unravel. They thought they had time. They thought you'd stay. They thought your loyalty was blind. And maybe it was for a while. Because you loved deeply. You gave chances. You believed in change. You tried to understand them. But that's the thing, they never saw that as strength. They saw it as submission. And that miscalculation, that arrogance, was their undoing. Because people who play games with other people's hearts rarely expect those people to wake up. They count on fatigue. They count on guilt. They count on you being too broken to leave. But when you did, when you left with dignity, with purpose, with your mind finally clear, that wasn't just a choice, it was a collapse. For them. Because now, without the illusion of control, without the image they fed others, without the puppet strings they thought were invisible, they're left with one terrifying truth: you were never theirs to control. Your soul was never up for negotiation. Your worth was never dependent on their acceptance. You were always free, you just had to remember. And once you did, their kingdom fell. Quietly. Completely. Because when the foundation is built on delusion, truth doesn't knock, it detonates. They lost not because you exposed them with words, but because you reclaimed yourself in silence. And that silence wasn't passive. It was active. It was decisive. It was the sound of their illusion dying, and your clarity being born. 2. Your exit wasn't rage, it was clarity. When you left, it wasn't dramatic. There were no loud goodbyes, no final arguments, no scorched earth. That's what confused them. That's what shattered the illusion. Because they had played out the scene in their mind 100 times. You broken, you desperate, you needing closure or validation, or just one more chance to be understood. But instead, you left quietly. And in that quiet, their whole strategy fell apart. See, they didn't just expect a reaction, they needed it. Rage would have been easier. Screaming would have made sense to them. If you had begged, if you had fought, if you had gone out in flames, it would have fed their narrative. It would have proven their version of you, the unstable one, the emotional one, the one they tried to portray when the mask started to slip. But clarity? That was the one thing they didn't prepare for. You didn't explode. You didn't collapse. You didn't make a scene. You simply saw the game and stopped playing it. And that unnerved them far more than anything else you could have done. Because clarity is irreversible. Once you see manipulation for what it is, you can't unsee it. Once you realize your emotional labor was fuel for someone else's ego, you can't keep giving it. Once you understand that peace is not found through performance but through detachment, the dynamics shift permanently. And that's what happened, you shifted. You walked not in anger, but in understanding. You didn't need to prove your worth to someone who had spent so much time trying to erode it. You didn't need a final word. You didn't need justice. Because what Stoicism teaches us is that peace comes from mastery of the self, not domination of others. And that is what they could never comprehend. They thought silence was defeat. But your silence was actually a fully informed, deliberate refusal to be used as a prop in someone else's performance. You exited the stage, not because you couldn't handle the play, but because you finally saw the script. And you realized the only way to win was to walk out of the theater entirely. That's why they're still stuck in the same cycles, replaying the same scenes, rehearsing new ways to twist the story. Because you left the show, but they're still addicted to the drama. They're still waiting for you to return with noise, to re-engage, to validate their role as the misunderstood one. But you gave them nothing. And that nothing? That was the most powerful thing you could have ever delivered. It told the truth without words. It revealed the imbalance. It exposed the game. And it shook the very identity they built on your reaction. Because they didn't just lose a relationship. They lost their mirror. They lost the person they could manipulate, the one they could draw energy from, the one who made them feel superior. When you left in clarity, they were forced to face themselves. And for someone who has built their whole identity around managing other people's perceptions, that is pure terror. It's also why they talk about you long after you've moved on. Why they still paint you as bitter, unstable, or cruel, because to admit the truth would be to accept that their tactics failed. That their manipulations were seen and walked away from. And that kind of exposure, the kind where no one points fingers, no one shouts, but everyone simply sees the truth, that's devastating. That's what makes clarity so threatening. It requires no defense. It has no weak spots. It speaks in stillness and acts with purpose. And they don't know how to combat that. Because they were prepared for a fight, not for your peace. That's the Stoic difference. Stoicism doesn't react to bait. It doesn't seek revenge. It doesn't depend on being right in public. It knows that the only thing worth mastering is yourself. And you mastered it. You chose silence not out of fear, but out of strength. You chose distance not out of avoidance, but out of deep knowing. You knew staying would only serve the dysfunction. You knew speaking would only feed the narrative. You knew that truth doesn't need an audience to be real. And so you walked. Not with noise, not with fury, but with certainty. And that was what they couldn't anticipate. They had plans for your rage, contingency for your breakdown, a whole playbook for how to spin your reaction into proof of their victimhood. But they had no plan for your composure. No response to your stillness. No strategy for someone who simply chooses themselves. And that's the part they can't get over. Because the clarity that carried you out the door didn't just end the relationship, it redefined it. It changed the meaning of everything that came before. All the gaslighting, all the cycles, all the manipulation, they don't get to be rewritten now. They don't get to be repackaged as mutual or misunderstood. Because your exit was truth in motion. It was a lived declaration that the game is over. That you see now. That you're done now. That you've returned to yourself. And returning to yourself, in Stoic relationships, is the most powerful homecoming of all. So if you're watching this right now, and you've walked away not with rage but with clarity, understand what you've done. You've broken the spell. You've removed the mask. And you've reclaimed something no manipulator can ever touch, your peace. And if this part of your story resonates with you, if you've ever walked away in silence and felt the entire house of cards fall behind you, I want you to do something simple right now. Like this video, and drop a comment with, number 1, to let others know that you see it, that you lived it, that you understand. And if you're just now learning what stoicism and emotional clarity can really mean for your life, go ahead and subscribe. Because we're not done. There's so much more to explore, and your growth, your stillness, deserves to be supported and seen. 3. Healing quietly exposed their game. Healing doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up with fireworks or demand recognition. Real healing, deep, stoic healing, moves in silence, in the quiet choices you make when no one is watching, and the boundaries you build without needing to explain them. And this, more than any retaliation, is what exposed them. They weren't ready for it because manipulators don't prepare for your growth. They prepare for your destruction. They choreograph your collapse. They count on your confusion and build their image of control around your emotional dependency. But when you chose to heal instead of react, to rebuild instead of seek revenge, to detach instead of explain, everything they depended on began to crumble. And it didn't happen with a dramatic takedown. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, in the places where they used to have power, and suddenly, they didn't. That's the devastating truth they never saw coming. Because you were never their enemy, you were their mirror. They didn't realize their games only worked because you once played along, once questioned yourself, once tolerated more than you should have. But healing pulled the plug. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It started when you stopped justifying your emotions, stopped accepting mixed signals, stopped internalizing their projections. That's when their game began to lose its script. Because their power was rooted not in reality, but in performance, and when the audience stops responding, the play falls flat. That's what makes stoicism so transformative in these moments. It gives you back your emotional autonomy. It reminds you that no one, no matter how cleverly they play, can define your value. And once you begin to truly live that, not just say it, not just post it, but embody it, your entire presence changes. You become less reactive, less accessible to chaos. You develop an unshakable internal calm. And that calm is what drives manipulators mad. Because it's not defensive. It's not reactive. It's just present. Still. Clear. And in that presence, their tactics start to fail. The silent treatment no longer destabilizes you. The guilt trips fall flat. The projection doesn't stick. Why? Because you've healed the part of you that needed their approval. You've grown past the part of you that believed you had to earn love through suffering. You've stopped seeing their drama as your responsibility. And that terrifies them. Because what they fear most is not your anger, it's your evolution. They can twist anger. They can reframe rage. But they can't manipulate peace. They don't know how to spin indifference. They can't find leverage in stillness. That's why your healing exposed them. Because while they were performing victimhood, you were living truth. While they were rehearsing their next manipulation, you were detaching with quiet strength. While they were monitoring you, hoping you'd react, you were turning inward and cleaning up the wreckage they left behind. And with every quiet step forward, you illuminated the dysfunction they tried so hard to hide. It showed in your refusal to argue. It showed in the way you stopped engaging. It showed in your tone, your boundaries, your peace. And to those watching, the contrast was undeniable. One person spinning stories, another living quietly. One person pointing fingers, the other moving forward without a word. That's what revealed the game. And you didn't have to explain anything. You didn't have to expose them. You just had to keep healing. Because healing, real healing, has a frequency to it. People feel it. It radiates. It steadies your energy. It sharpens your discernment. It changes the way you carry yourself. And that change is loud, even when you say nothing. Especially when you say nothing. That's why they're unraveling now. Because for so long, they thrived on reaction. They thrived on pulling you back into the chaos just when you started to rise. But this time you didn't return. This time your absence held. Your boundary held. And that boundary isn't just space, it's a message. A declaration that their access to you is no longer a right. It must be earned, and they no longer qualify. That shift? That clarity? It's everything. Because in Stoic relationships, healing isn't just about moving on. It's about moving differently. It's about growing in such a way that the old dynamics can no longer survive in your presence. And that's exactly what happened. Their old tricks lost power. Their old image lost credibility. Their old patterns no longer pulled you in. Because you had healed the part of you that once accepted crumbs as affection. You had replaced performance with purpose. And that transformation exposed everything. Not through confrontation. Not through campaigns. But through consistency. Through the steady, grounded way you showed up for yourself, day after day, without needing to be seen. That's what healing is. And that's what they couldn't fight. Because the game was never built to withstand your growth. It was designed to collapse the moment you no longer needed it. And now, that collapse is happening, not because you broke them, but because you fixed yourself. 4. Growth reclaimed your power. Growth doesn't always feel like power at first. In fact, it often begins in confusion, in the quiet mourning of the version of yourself you had to let go of. It starts when you stop chasing explanations and start asking better questions, ones like, "What do I deserve?" And, "Why did I stay so long in a place that required me to shrink?" Those questions don't come from weakness. They come from awakening. And once that awakening begins, you can't go back. That's where power returns, not suddenly, not loudly, but incrementally, through every boundary you once struggled to enforce, through every moment of peace you protect, through every time you choose not to re-engage with dysfunction you once tolerated. Growth reclaims your power in the exact places you once handed it over. It's not a one-time event. It's a slow shedding of old beliefs that kept you compliant, kept you small, kept you hooked on someone else's validation. It's the quiet internal shift that says, "I no longer need to be chosen by someone who made me feel unworthy." That shift is terrifying to manipulators because their influence doesn't survive in an environment of clarity. Their tactics need your insecurity, your self-doubt, your willingness to sacrifice your peace for their comfort. But the more you grow, the more their influence begins to dissolve. The stories they used to tell you about yourself, how you're too much or not enough, how you're impossible to love, how your standards are unreasonable, those stories lose weight when you no longer carry them. That's the beauty of Stoicism. It grounds you in who you are, not who someone else has trained you to believe you are. It returns your focus inward. It silences the noise of false narratives and reminds you that your peace is not a performance, it's a principle. And once you begin to live that truth, everything changes. Suddenly, their silence no longer feels like punishment. Their approval no longer feels like a lifeline. Their chaos no longer feels like your responsibility. That's not coldness, that's growth. That's reclaiming authority over your inner world. That's realizing you don't have to be reactive to prove your worth. You don't have to explain your boundaries to those who are committed to violating them. You don't have to keep making space for people who only show up when it benefits them. That realization changes how you show up in every room, in every relationship, in every conversation. You speak with more precision, not because you're trying to convince anyone, but because you no longer doubt your own voice. You love with more discernment, not because you're closed off, but because you've learned that access to you is sacred. You walk with more intention, not because you're trying to prove something, but because you've stopped chasing people who don't value your presence. And all of that? That's power. Power that can't be faked. Power that can't be gifted. Power that can't be taken away by anyone who didn't give it to you in the first place. That's the kind of transformation they never accounted for. Because they weren't prepared for you to grow. They were prepared for you to stay in the cycle. They were prepared for you to need closure. They were prepared for you to come back and re-engage, hoping to be seen. But instead, you became the version of yourself that no longer needs their recognition. You stopped playing the role they wrote for you. And in doing so, you tore up the script completely. That's when things started shifting for them, too. Not because you told the world the truth, but because the world could feel the shift in you. Your energy changed. Your habits changed. Your presence changed. And without you having to say a word, the contrast became undeniable. People started noticing how calm you were, how grounded, how unbothered. And that contrast is what exposed everything. Not only did your healing show that you had moved on, it showed just how dependent they were on your former chaos. And here's where Stoic relationships separate from reactive ones. In Stoicism, we don't just seek peace, we protect it. We don't explain our growth, we live it. We don't try to control how others see us, we focus on how we see ourselves. And the people who once thrived off your confusion, they start panicking. Not because you're attacking them, but because your evolution makes their dysfunction impossible to ignore. That's the real power of growth. It doesn't need revenge. It doesn't need confrontation. It speaks for itself in every boundary you enforce, in every apology you stop chasing, in every space you no longer shrink to fit inside. And that's what eats them alive. Because now, every move you make without them is proof that they were never the foundation of your life. They were the distraction from it. Every success you build without their voice in your ear undermines the lies they told about your capacity. Every peaceful day you live on your own terms exposes the control they used to wield. And the best part? You don't have to say a thing. You just keep becoming. You keep building. You keep evolving. You keep choosing the version of yourself that no longer needs to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. That's how growth reclaims your power, by making you whole without them. And if this truth speaks to you, if you've felt the slow and steady transformation of reclaiming your own narrative, then let others know they're not alone. Like this video and comment, number 1, below if you felt yourself grow stronger in silence. And if you're ready to explore stoicism, clarity, and unshakable self-respect in deeper ways, make sure you subscribe. There's more to come. And you deserve to keep building this kind of strength. 5. Their identity collapsed without access to you. They didn't just lose you, they lost the version of themselves that only existed through your presence. That's what shattered them. Because for people who build their identity on control, on performance, on the manipulation of perception, access isn't just convenience, it's lifeblood. Your emotional availability wasn't just a feature of the relationship, it was the foundation of their self-image. As long as you were reachable, pliable, reactive, they could maintain the illusion that they were powerful, needed, even essential. But when you cut off access, not out of spite, but out of necessity, they didn't just lose influence. They lost a part of themselves they had constructed entirely around your energy. And in that loss, their identity began to collapse. See, the thing about manipulators is they often don't know who they are without an audience. Their narratives only work when someone is there to absorb them. Their sense of self-worth isn't cultivated from within. It's extracted from the people they control. So when you stopped reacting, stopped answering, stopped defending, they weren't just angry, they were destabilized. You took away the mirror that reflected back a version of them they curated with precision. Without you there to reflect their false humility, their projected victimhood, their carefully crafted role as the misunderstood martyr, they were left staring at something unfamiliar, themselves. And what they saw was unbearable. Because without your empathy to soften their edges, without your presence to validate their story, without your compassion to cushion their dysfunction, they were exposed, not to the world first, but to themselves. And that kind of internal exposure, that raw confrontation with one's own emptiness, is what they fear most. They'll do anything to avoid it. That's why they tried to pull you back in. Not out of love, not out of regret, but out of desperation to reclaim the identity they lost when you walked. Because your absence wasn't just silence. It was a spotlight. A spotlight that revealed how much of their power was dependent on your willingness to play a role you never agreed to. And once you stepped out of that role, the entire performance unraveled. Not because you denounced them, but because your disinterest made the performance irrelevant. That's what Stoicism does. It starves the illusion by refusing to feed it with emotional reactivity. It breaks the cycle by remaining grounded in truth. It doesn't retaliate, it dissolves the need for retaliation by rendering the game meaningless. And that's exactly what you did. You made their tactics obsolete. You rendered their manipulation ineffective. And in doing so, you disrupted their self-narrative. Because if they couldn't control you, what did that say about the image they worked so hard to protect? If you no longer feared their disapproval, who else might stop fearing it too? These are the questions they don't want to ask, but can't avoid once you're no longer in their orbit. And every time they try to rewrite the story, every time they speak your name in bitterness, every time they attempt to bait you back into the dance, they're revealing more than they know. They're not showing that they've moved on. They're showing that their identity is still tied to a version of you that no longer exists. And that's where the collapse becomes irreversible. Because no matter how many times they tell the story, it no longer sticks the same. People start to notice the inconsistencies, the bitterness, the obsession, and they contrast that with your quiet growth, your calm distance, your focused energy, and the truth begins to surface without you saying a word. That's what makes your detachment so powerful. It's not passive. It's purposeful. It's the quiet dismantling of an identity that was always built on borrowed worth. And now, as they stand without you, without the reflection, without the access, they're forced to confront the hollowness of their persona. They can't just find someone new and recreate it, because what they had with you wasn't based on genuine connection. It was based on your willingness to stay small. Your tendency to see the good even when the good was used as a tool for harm. Your inclination to give more than you received. And now that you've grown, now that you've reclaimed your power, they can't replicate that. Not easily. Because what made the connection powerful wasn't them, it was your depth. Your empathy. Your unwavering hope. And those qualities, once used against you, are now protected by discernment. They're guarded by clarity. They're refined by Stoic wisdom. So yes, their identity is crumbling. Not because you attacked it, but because it was never real to begin with. It was a construction held up by your energy, your validation, your presence. And now that those things are gone, the mask is slipping faster than they can hold it up. That's the hidden cost of manipulation. They believe they can use others to build a stable sense of self, but what they actually create is a fragile house of mirrors. And the moment one reflection walks away, the whole structure begins to crack. So they scramble. They blame. They distort. They reach for new characters, new stages, new scripts. But the foundation has already shifted. And nothing they build now feels the same. Because the truth they can't escape is this: the person they tried to break is the same person whose presence held their image together. And that's not something they can replace. That's something they have to live with. And they do. Every day. Quietly. Restlessly. Haunted not by what you said, but by what you didn't. By the peace you found. By the clarity you now live in. By the fact that you've stopped looking back, and in doing so, have forced them to look at themselves. 6. The realization that you were the source of power. There comes a moment, often late and always painfully, when they realize the truth they spent so long avoiding. It was never them. It was always you. You were the emotional center. You were the source of warmth, of connection, of meaning. You brought the presence, the empathy, the resilience that made the entire dynamic function. Without your depth, without your commitment, without your willingness to believe in their potential even while they chipped away at your peace, there would have been nothing for them to feed off. And when that realization hits them, it does not arrive gently. It crashes. Because they didn't just lose a relationship, they lost their power supply. You see, manipulators don't create value, they siphon it. They don't generate energy, they steal it from the people who haven't yet realized how much they're giving away. But once you wake up, once you grow, once you step back and take inventory of what you allowed, what you tolerated, what you gave without reciprocation, that's when the dynamic dies. Not from confrontation, but from realization. Your realization, and eventually, theirs. And theirs is brutal. Because now they understand that every attempt to diminish you was a twisted way of securing control. That every moment they disrespected your boundaries wasn't power, it was fear. Fear of your independence. Fear of your clarity. Fear that one day, you would see through the illusion and stop giving them the energy that sustained their ego. And that's exactly what happened. You stopped being a character in their story. You became the author of your own. You stopped trying to earn a place in their chaos and started reclaiming your place in peace. And as your presence withdrew, so did their illusion of power. What remained was silence, stillness, and the gaping absence of everything they depended on you to supply. Because your presence was never passive, it was foundational. Your support wasn't background noise, it was the entire structure. And when that structure was removed, what they built collapsed. That's why they spiral now. That's why they stalk your energy, even if from a distance. That's why they still talk about you. Because they're chasing the echo of what they destroyed. They're trying to recreate a power dynamic they didn't fully understand until it was gone. And here's the paradox. The more you evolve, the more their weakness becomes visible. Not to you, you've moved on, but to them. In the quiet of their own reflection, they begin to see it. The fake strength. The false superiority. The dependence they denied. And most damning of all, the truth that what they most tried to control was what they most relied on. You. And that reliance? That imbalance? That need? It was never mutual. Because while you were giving with sincerity, they were taking with strategy. While you were building something real, they were leveraging something artificial. While you were fighting for the connection, they were fighting to keep the upper hand. But now that the roles are gone, now that the mask has slipped, now that you've walked away with nothing but your truth, they are left to confront the source. And it was never them. It was always you. That's why your silence screams louder than any accusation. That's why your peace rattles their image. That's why your growth is the loudest exposure of all. Because you didn't just move on, you ascended. You became untouchable in the ways that matter most. Not because you hardened, but because you healed. Not because you closed your heart, but because you stopped opening it to chaos. And now, without access, without your energy to define themselves by, they're lost. Unanchored. Confronted with the terrifying reality that the person they believed they could control was actually the source of their own fragile identity. That is what destroys them. Not your revenge. Not your words. Not even your success. But your clarity. Your refusal to stay. Your ability to walk with calm, with dignity, with no need to look back. Because people who survive manipulation and rise with intention don't just change their lives. They redefine what power looks like. And in Stoic relationships, that's the final truth. Real power doesn't come from control. It comes from freedom. And now that you've reclaimed it, they're left with nothing but the memory of what they tried to break, and the devastating awareness that they only ever had power because you hadn't yet realized you were the source. And if that realization has come to you, if you've finally seen yourself as the center of strength, of clarity, of peace, then I want you to mark that moment right now. Like this video, and drop a number 1 in the comments below to remind yourself and others that you were always the source. And if you're just stepping into this truth, if you're ready to explore Stoicism and how it reshapes not just relationships but your entire sense of self, then hit subscribe. This is only the beginning, and where you're going, they can't follow. You didn't win by fighting. You didn't win by arguing louder, by proving them wrong in the court of public opinion, or by gathering your own army of validation. You didn't win by shouting your truth to a world too distracted to listen. You won because you stopped needing to. You won the moment you chose stillness over spectacle. The moment you stopped showing up for a game that was never meant to serve you. The moment you realized that being misunderstood by someone invested in confusion is not your burden to carry. That was your turning point, not the climax of the drama, but the quiet birth of your transformation. And in that stillness, in that sacred inner resolve, something fundamental shifted. You no longer looked outward for the verdict. You no longer measured your worth by the reactions of the very person who worked so hard to distort your sense of self. You came home, to yourself, to your values, to your truth. And that return marked the beginning of everything they thought you would never become. Strong, grounded, untouchable. And that's why they still spiral. That's why they still talk. Because they're not fighting you anymore, They're fighting the reality that you no longer need them, no longer fear them, no longer orbit the emotional planet they built out of chaos and charm. They are stuck in a war that ended the moment you laid down your sword and walked away. And now, in the absence of your energy, their world feels smaller. The echo of your silence is louder than any explanation you could have offered. The calm in your presence is more revealing than any accusation you could have leveled. Because true power doesn't come from winning arguments. It comes from no longer needing to have them. And that's what Stoicism has always taught, not just endurance, but elevation. Not just survival, but sovereignty. You didn't just exit their life. You evolved beyond their reach. And that evolution wasn't loud. It didn't need applause. It didn't come with warnings. It was subtle, earned, internal. You faced the parts of yourself they tried to break. You confronted the identity they manipulated, the beliefs they planted, the wounds they exploited. And instead of collapsing, you chose to heal. Instead of raging, you chose to rebuild. That is the story now. Not what they did, but what you became. Not how they betrayed you, but how you responded to the betrayal. Not the pain itself, but what the pain revealed, and how you refused to stay there. You see, healing is not a return to who you were before them. It's an evolution into who you were always meant to be. Someone wiser, sharper, softer in the right ways and steel in the others. Someone who now recognizes manipulation for what it is. Someone who no longer negotiates with disrespect. Someone who doesn't feel the need to explain their boundaries because they are no longer afraid of being seen as difficult, selfish, or cold. Someone who knows that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of alignment. And that's what your silence, your growth, your detachment now represents. Alignment. Not passivity. Not weakness. Alignment with truth, with purpose, with dignity. They mistook your healing for indifference. But indifference is apathy. Healing is discipline. A quiet, intentional refusal to let someone else's chaos dictate the rhythm of your life. And now, they are left with their own reflection. Not because you punished them, but because you stopped participating in the lie. And that kind of detachment? It's devastating. Because it doesn't just remove them from your life. It forces them to see who they are without your presence to cushion their flaws. Without your forgiveness to make them feel like they weren't that bad. Without your empathy to soften the consequences. And that is the greatest justice, not because it destroys them, but because it reveals them. And reveals you. You are no longer the version of yourself that was confused, desperate, emotionally hungry for approval. You are not the person who once begged to be understood. That person existed only in the shadow of the game. But the real you? The healed you? The you that came through the fire with clear eyes and a grounded heart? That you is unrecognizable to them. And that's exactly how it should be. Because growth is not meant to be palatable to those who profited from your silence. Healing is not meant to be comfortable for those who created the wounds. And Stoic relationships are not built on submission, they are built on clarity, neutrality, integrity. You've stepped into that space now. And from that space, you see everything more clearly. Not just them, but yourself. You see why it had to happen. Why it had to break. Why it couldn't be saved. Not because you were weak, but because you were waking up. Not because they were too strong, but because they were never truly stable to begin with. And now, from where you stand, there is no desire to go back. No need for revenge. No interest in chaos. Just peace. Just purpose. Just progress. And that is the full circle moment. The day you realize you didn't just walk away to escape them, you walked away to come home to yourself. You walked away because your soul was tired of pretending that love and pain had to coexist. You walked away because you no longer needed to be chosen by someone who couldn't even see themselves clearly. You walked away because the only thing left to prove was to yourself. That you were worthy. That you were whole. That you were always enough. And you are. Still. Quietly. Completely. That's the story now. That's the legacy. Not of pain, but of power. Not of confusion, but of clarity. Not of defeat, but of return. So carry it with you. Let it shape how you move. Let it shape what you accept. Let it shape what you never again allow. Because the past can only control you if you give it a voice louder than your growth. And your growth now speaks for itself. Stoicism is not about suppressing pain, it's about transforming it. Stoic relationships are not about perfection, they're about reflection. And as you reflect now, you will see not just the cracks in the story, but the path forward. Clear, steady, unshaken. You didn't just survive them. You outgrew the version of yourself who thought survival was all there was. You created peace they can't access, freedom they can't follow, clarity they can't manipulate. And in that stillness, in that refusal to return, you became everything they feared you might one day become, fully you. Finally free. And forever above the noise.